Okay, so before we talk about the next, well, whatever our next story is that we need to cover, I want to make sure to share and talk a little bit about the essay and essay format. Since some people will be turning in, a lot of people are still getting their topics to me, so it's taking a while to get through that. But if anybody chooses to turn in a rough draft, then I can make sure that they kind of are following the at least if they watch this recording, they're going to get a sense of exactly what they're supposed to have done. Now, if any of you were on the chat for Tuesday night, since that was our last live chat, what did we discuss Tuesday night? What story? And you can just put it in chat or you can tell me either way.
Treasure in the Forest, wasn't it?
Okay, so the treasure in the forest was what we covered. Because I covered different things with different people, but I wanted to make sure that I covered what was most important next and I don't skip anything. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm also going to post the chats I have with my Thursday group, unless that we're discussing a short story that you don't cover, because they have a longer class because they're a high school class, and so they have like 2 or 3 extra weeks. So there are a few short stories that I will discuss with them that you guys don't read. So those I will leave out, but otherwise any of the live discussions I'm going to post in both this classroom and in the other classroom so that everybody gets all the detail, just in case I miss up and I say something in one class and don't say it in the other. I don't want anybody to not get it. But if we talked about that, then that means I'm just trying to make sure we cover everything. Okay, so we have covered all of that from the week of the 28th through the 1st. And so what we will do first, we're going to go ahead and talk about the essays first. And you're probably seeing an essay in front of you. And then we'll talk about, hopefully we'll get to the horse dealer's daughter today. Because I want to make sure if there's anything there. I mean, it's one of those interesting stories. So we'll see. We'll at least get started on it, and then maybe we can finish it tomorrow if we don't finish it tonight. So that's at least my intent. But let's talk about the actual format first. I've had several people ask me questions. That's one reason I wanted to make sure and cover this in the live session. Now, you two, I'm going to go ahead and bring the participants up. Okay, so you two, do you know which of the topics you're doing? Are you doing the write your own short story and explain kind of why you picked, what was your inspiration and why did you pick that story and blah, blah, blah? Or are you doing the one that's comparing two short stories together? Oh, a kid.
Sorry, I'm
No, that's
babysitting.
fine. I love kids. So you just go ahead
She's
and make all the noise you like.
talkative.
Okay, so
I am writing my own short story, but it's inspired by The Treasure in the Forest, which is the one we covered last Tuesday.
yes.
And I don't know, I one of the things that I thought was cool is just the idea of switching the characters from male to female. I thought was kind of interesting.
Okay.
And then with that, just because like I'm engaged, so I know how my fiance is, and he does not pay as close to attention. And I just felt like if it was women who were the main characters, they probably would have paid more attention to the fact there was a dead guy,
Right.
and they wouldn't have ended up in the issues they were in.
Well, it's funny because I think for our drama section, you'll probably want to pay attention because I think we're doing it. Just want to make sure. Um I don't have that one printed off. Darn. Um in our drama section, which is the last section of this class, we actually cover, I think we're going to do the play Trifles, which is a short play. And in it, it's actually two women. No, we don't get, yeah, we do. Okay, yeah, journal, because chapter 6 has trifles in it. And women are in the play, and they're the ones kind of like the men are there officially investigating a crime. Someone was murdered. And yet the women are just sorting through some of the stuff of the wives because the husband was murdered. And they notice things that the men don't notice and wouldn't even care about and wouldn't understand because they're women. And so it's interesting that you bring that up because that's interesting. Okay, so what about Brooke? Brooke, are you writing your own story or are you comparing two stories?
That was me. That was Brooke.
Oh, okay, sorry. I don't know why I
You're
thought it was
fine.
you. So Jordan, you're also doing a write your own. Okay.
I am.
Since both of you are doing that, we'll talk about that first. And then, obviously, no matter which one you do, I want you to follow MLA format. And so it's just like you would have normally done in Comp 1. You still have your name and, the MLA heading, which is going to just be standard like you can see this page, right?
Yes.
Okay. So it's just, you'd put your name in there, you'd put my name in there, and this one is a humanities paper, but you would just put English 1102, and then you'd put the date. Notice how they have the 2 August 2, so you would just have August 2nd or 2 August with no comma and 2017. So either one's fine. In fact, I can even fix that. I actually prefer this way of doing it. So, and then the title is the same font, same size, no bolds, everything is just double spaced. A few students, and this is pretty common because Word is silly. I'm just going to Control A for a second, because I'm going to show you why it's the way it is. Let's see. After. Okay, I'm just going to do that. So you noticed it changed somewhat. And all it does is in Word, automatically Word decides that its default is that they're going to put in spacing after anytime you return it. And that means that like everything's extended a little bit. There's extra spacing after the title. There's extra spacing in the heading, these 4 words of, the 4 lines of the heading and between paragraphs. Well, that's not okay. So I'm just going to go ahead and if you do have your paper that looks like this, if you have that extra spacing going on, all you have to do is go up into paragraph and then make sure that that after is set to 0 and before is set to 0. And then that'll correct all of those problems. Now you can see that this is now single spaced, so we can just make it double spaced so that the whole thing's double spaced all the way through. There should be no extra spacing though anywhere, and make sure you have, this is just kind of standard paragraphs. Okay, so now in your particular cases, because both of you are writing an original short story that's inspired by one of the ones you've read, then what you're going to do is your title can be anything you like. I mean, it could be the title of your short story, it could be a new version of, and then you could put the title of the other short story. That's fine. Any of that will work. Honestly, it's up to you, but you need to have a title. And don't put, like fiction essay, because that's too generic. If anything, your title should tell us what's your paper going to be about. So
Did you say it could be the same as the short story one?
like it could, well, I mean, your title could be the title of your short story. Like if you had whatever it is, instead of in the forest, maybe it happened somewhere else or whatever, then you could put it and put the modified title. I would not make the title of your short story the same as the title of the inspiration short story. Like if you're talking about shooting an elephant, don't make it shooting an elephant part 2. Make it shooting something else, or understanding the elephant, or it has to at least be some modification so we know it's not the same story as Orwell's. And honestly, it's best if you don't use the same words. Like, don't just change parts of the story, because that's really plagiarism. Instead, make a whole new story, but you're just using the other one as inspiration. Okay, but you can use the title of your short story, the new one that you've created. That can be the title of your paper. That's fine. Or you can say, that you're making, an original short story based on. That's fine too. Or you could have a subtitle. So you could have your title, and then you could say, do a colon, and then have like, and just say a short, let's see, a story based, actually I should capitalize that, based on So you can do it that way. That's fine. So whatever you want to do, the main thing is it should not say this is what's not acceptable is, because that's telling us nothing. It's just saying what your assignment is. Oh, then you can even put in here, literally you could put sequel, the sequel, but put her name in it. I mean, you could put the author's name. I would put to Kate Chopin's like that, or a sequel, or I'm not really going to grade you on whether I like your title exactly or not. Mostly I'm just going to grade you on that you have a title that does tell me what your paper's about. Okay, now because you're both doing the other version, you'll need to have, essentially you have two parts to your essay. The first part, or it's preferable to have it to be the first part. You need a couple of paragraphs that answer pertinent questions that are listed on the assignment sheet. Things like, why did you pick the short story that you picked, as your inspiration? What was it about that short story that appealed to you or that you thought was interesting and would make another good version? Number two, why in the world, what did you change? What did you make, and why did you make those changes? If you changed the characters and made them female, how did that make things different? There's actually a novel, oh, what was it called? It's a long time ago I read it and I did not like it. But it's essentially about a bunch of boys on a ship. I'm just looking for a second. Who get shipwrecked, and it's a, not that, Lord of the Flies. That's what, I can't remember it. I'll put that right in here on the chat. And the man who wrote it, I hated the book when I read it. I was honestly one of those that I wished I hadn't read. Now I could probably handle it more, but I was I don't know, a 10th grader or 11th grader. And I was much, much, much younger. But the boys do horrible things together. It's almost like what happens when government is gone and it's just people are left to their own devices. And the truth is at least according to this book, they do horrible things to each other. And it's all a group of young boys. And they end up killing one of the boys. And it's just horrible. But he wrote, the author said, in some people ask, why was it just boys? And he says, because girls wouldn't do what the boys did. He said, girls simply don't resort to violence the way that boys do. And so they had to be a group of boys. And I thought that was really interesting because, we have all this question, there's so much been studied about how men and women are different. And the truth is in some ways, men and women are really different. And in some ways too, we can use those differences to make something really interesting. And so, does that make sense? That's, so you can talk about that, that you chose to make the characters female instead of male because blah, 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 and explain it. So, take several paragraphs and try to explain, why did you make the choices that you made when you wrote the story? What is it that you were trying to do with it? And how does it change the message that comes out? How does it change the events? Or what did you want to happen? Essentially, you're explaining why you wrote it and why that you made the choices in it that you wrote. So if you're doing a sequel, Jordan, to Desiree's Baby, then you would have to, in some ways, explain why did you, first of all, feel like it needed an ending? And second, what were you hoping to do with the choices you made in that ending, if that makes sense? So you're trying to essentially explain to us why you made the artistic choices that you made and how and you can even address things like, what do you think the author's going to would think if she were to read your stuff? Is it more modern because you ended it the way that you ended it? Could we, even with what happens, can this kind of a story like Desiree's Baby, could it happen today? The truth is yes. There are people. I know I had one guy actually admit to me that he denied both of his first two children in the hospital because he said they looked too white, actually. And then he found out from the nurses that his baby's going to get darker, and he needs to not reject his wife and claim that she cheated on him. But he literally had done that and claimed that she had cheated on him. So, you know, it's funny. I'd never thought anybody would ever say that, and yet that's true. So you can tell me how you know, why did you pick what you picked? What, you know, why, and why did you make the specific artistic choices? Then once you've described all that in a few paragraphs, show me the story. And then that's literally it. You don't have to have a conclusion at the end of the story. You know, just let let those, you know, paragraphs at the beginning kind of explain what it is you were hoping to do with the story. And I'll look at that and look at how you express all of that to me. And, you know, is it complete enough? Does it cover, you know, some of these? And I may have lingering questions, but so, and I, you know, and then I want to see the story. Does it have, are its characters clear? Does it have a point to it? Does it have a clear beginning, middle, and end? You know, is it a satisfying story? Does it kind of round up everything so it's, you know, does it have meaning? And that's what I'm going to look for. So in some ways, the expression you give me at the beginning is a way for me to make sure I'm reading what you want me to hear. You know, that I'm seeing what you intended for readers to see. And so, and that you're really, I mean, in some ways it's reflecting on the other story. So it's showing both that you understood the other story that inspired you, but also that you were doing something unique with what you created. Does that all make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Now, if you're not doing that, obviously both of you are doing this type of story, so we don't have to worry about you guys. But for the, you know, for the sake of the other students out there, if they're writing the comparison story, if they're comparing one short story to another, the main thing is that they have two stories picked out and that they have one element that they think is running through both of them. And so hopefully, you know, I had some people say that they really wanted to write about a particular short story because of this. And so I tried to give them in the replies to them other stories they could link it to. You know, oh, well, that if you like that theme, it's also in this story and this story, because you need two stories. And then your introduction will be a you know, essentially expressing that you're going to compare how these two different stories deal with the same theme, whatever your theme is, differently. And how one, and then your thesis statement really needs to express how does one story deal with it and how does the other story deal with it, so that we know kind of where you're generally going to go overall. I don't want it to just say in the thesis statement, these two stories deal with the same theme differently. Well, of course they do. But how do they deal with it differently? Be more descriptive in a thesis. And then you can talk all about one story, and you'll actually quote the story. In fact, even in your own stories, the one that you guys are doing, you can quote your own story or the inspiration story as you're discussing different things. That's perfectly cool. In fact, if you need to quote it to make it vivid so that I know exactly what part of the story you're talking about, feel free. Quote it and cite it. And then, but certainly if you're comparing two stories, you need to make sure you quote and cite both of them. That you're explaining, you show me this is where, you know, in the horse dealer's daughter, you know, she talks about X, Y, and Z, and then he replies this. Well, I need to see that. And then you need to explain what you see that quote revealing. Okay, so probably the biggest thing for the comparison one, okay, that's a good question, Jordan. I'll get to that in a second. I'm so glad I have the chat up so I can just see that you're asking these questions. So the main thing, and you should talk about about one story and all about the next story, so that I don't want you to have to go back and forth between stories. It's better that you just talk all about the one story and how, you know, where does the theme come out and what is the author trying to say about it and how does that revealed in the actual lines of the story. And then switch to the next story and do the same thing. You know, what does the author seem to be using this theme for? What messages are coming through? How do they view? And then at the end, after you've discussed both stories, after quoting it all, then at the end you need a conclusion that kind of sums up the comparison between the two. Why would one story express a view of that same theme different than the other? Does it come from the time period? Is it because of the author? Is one author a man and one a woman? Or was one, did he just live far later? And so it's a more modern story and we have a different way of viewing that. Who knows? So it's up to you. It depends on whatever the theme was and whatever those works are. So the main thing is I'm going to be looking at, are you using the stories and really explaining what you see and explaining how those interpretations come about? Where did they come from, and how describing how you see or interpret particular lines. And then are you comparing the two together? Are you looking at how one theme pops up in one, and it doesn't have to be a theme. It can be a literary device. Maybe it's narration, and one is narrated by, first person, and she's telling her own story, and the next one is narrated third person. And what does that do? How does that change the story itself? Who knows? It's kind of up to you guys how you want to do that comparison. But either way, you still have two parts. You just have an intro that covers and mentions both parts and gives a meaningful thesis about both stories. Then you talk about one story, then talk about the other story, and then conclude with some sort of comparison. So, and that's really what I'm looking for there. Unless your short story ends up like super long, which it's okay if it does. I don't really have a page limit, like, oh no, you can't go over 5 pages. And I don't really have a minimum. But if you're going to talk about 2 stories or talk about the story you're writing and where it came from, and then show your story, we're talking at least 2.5, 3 pages to do it, to give it any justice. And so that's what I'm going to be looking for, is that you're giving it the depth and the analysis that it needs. So if it's super short, like you end up and you write all and you have everything and it's less than a page long, that's real short, y'all. And so what I would suggest is making the short story itself, since you guys are both writing a short story, make it longer, add detail, add dialogue, explain the characters, and don't assume, especially Jordan, I think you're doing the later, what happens after Desiree's baby. Yeah. If you're doing, don't assume that anyone's read the first story. Like if your story is going to stand on its own, let it stand on its own, develop who these people are. Because in a lot of ways, if you look at Desiree's baby, we know that Desiree was beautiful, and that's about it. She had brown hair, but her skin was lighter than Armand's. But we really don't have, besides the fact that it's on a plantation, we don't have a lot of description. And so feel free to add some description. Make that story how you imagine it to be, if that makes any sense. So if you're worried about length, don't be. I don't do the word count thing where, you have to, 1,500 words or 1,000 words, or nah. It needs to be enough, though. You need to have enough detail and enough development and explanation to really do what the paper's asking you to do. That's all. Does that all make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now let's switch. Let me go ahead and I'm going to move this over. I have to move all sorts of things over because everything is wackadoodle. Okay. Now I had to get to 11:02. So let's go, and let's talk about Horse Dealer's Daughter. Now, have you ever heard of the author of Horse Dealer's Daughter? Let me go ahead. Go to the journal. I'm just bringing it up before I share it. So I'm going to go ahead and stop that, and then I'll share that. Okay. That's the thing in WebEx, is I have to take down what I'm sharing before I can switch it to something else. So, unfortunate. Okay, so do you know who D.H. Lawrence is?
I don't think so.
Okay, so D.H. Lawrence is a British author. A lot of what we're reading actually in this class is a lot of British literature, mainly and world, because we don't really have a world lit class. I mean, we do if you're an education major, but we get a lot of American literature in some of the other stuff. So I tried to emphasize some British. Well, this is a British author, and his work has actually been banned, and it's still banned in a lot of countries. He is the author, probably his most famous novel, although I don't like it compared to a lot of his other ones, is Lady Chatterley's Lover. That's what he's probably best known for, because that work was banned. But he writes, and honestly, I love his short stories, even better than some of his novels. But he writes and he wrote at a time. I mean, this is 20th century, but it's barely. He didn't write in the 1980s. He wrote very early 20th century, and so he wrote a lot about people in intimate ways. So not just if he was writing about a couple, he didn't just write about, oh, then she did this and went and visited her neighbors and he went to work. No, they speak intimately, and they have, he doesn't describe it the way that, for instance, a lot of modern romance novels, get really graphic. He wasn't like that. But his stuff was seen as pornographic by a lot of people early in the 20th century. And so, and a lot of people were very uncomfortable with the level of intimacy that people, sometimes strangers, would have with each other. And that's actually included in this story, because we get to know these people very intimately and at a very vulnerable level. And for a lot of people, it's not polite. This is not how you're supposed to write about people. You keep your distance from them, and you don't get into the the dirty secrets or things like that. And you certainly don't express people being this physical with each other. Now, did they have a big encounter that was super sexual? And no, we see stuff like this all the time, in movies and on TV today. This is so tame compared to what we are used to as an audience. So it's kind of weird to, when people say, oh, this was banned. Well, again, Desiree's Baby would not have found a popular audience at the time it was written either. It was ahead of its time. And yet today, it wouldn't have been banned at all. So we've changed a lot, I guess, as a society. And D.H. Lawrence said, part of the reason this probably stemmed more from Freud and the understanding that like your psyche, your mental state could be affected by your sexuality, and especially repressed sexuality, that you aren't allowed to express what's true for you. And so D.H. Lawrence just said, look, we need to be open about these themes, because they matter in people's lives. And if we just ignore them or don't talk about them because we're too polite, nothing's ever going to get solved. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So he was trying to get at, why do we, in the same way that, not the same way that Freud did, because Freud was a little bit too sexualized maybe, but he was trying to get at, why do we do what we do? And, what changes us? And why do we, if we're going in one direction, why do we suddenly shift and go in another direction? So, and some of it is loneliness and solitude. Some of it is a feeling of helplessness. And so he does a lot of psychological literature, which I honestly appreciate. So there's an intimacy to it that I like personally. Now, at the same time, though, I didn't write this. So if y'all didn't like it, it's totally okay. I'm not going to go home and cry in my tea and go, oh no, they didn't like it, because I didn't write this. But if I were to be a famous writer of adult literature, this is the kind of thing I'd write, much more psychological, where you're getting into people's troubles. Now, what are the causes, though, of why is there a problem for Mabel, especially? Because she's really she and the doctor are the two main characters. And what's wrong with her life?
She and her brothers have no money because their father was in debt.
Yes. So a man, especially if he had land and had, some rank, a man could hold on to debt for years and years and years and not repay it. As soon as he dies, it was due. And so very often, and this is, I mean, it's probably too common. It's a horrible thing to do to people, but it's extremely often that people at this time would, they'd incur the loss of a family member, which was hard enough. But then on top of that, they'd find out, oh, wait a second, he owed a bunch of money to a bunch of different people and we can't pay the debt. And so people would lose houses because the man would either have the house mortgaged for something, to pay off those debts or whatever. And all of a sudden the mortgage would come due. Like they wouldn't let, if you inherited a house, you couldn't just, you know, ignore the fact that you had a mortgage and not pay it. And they wouldn't even let you like necessarily pay the same mortgage. You had to suddenly pay for the house. And so it was one of those financial things that, we have more protections today that help people, but we just didn't have protection. So in this case, Mabel and the brothers have no choice. They have to move out. They have to sell everything they can and pay off as much of the debt as they can. And the truth is they don't have anything left. Now, they're different though. At this time, women couldn't own property. And so any of the money to be had couldn't go to Mabel. And as it is, they didn't have a whole lot of money. If they sell it, then the men just have to go work in a different job and move, or, one guy's thinking of getting married and stuff. But then there's Mabel, and she can't stay in the house. She can't owe any money. She can't own anything else. And none of the brothers want her. And it's funny because the author establishes them first and they talk about her, but they don't just talk about her like, oh, well, what are we going to do with Mabel? And, oh, I can't believe she's going to be all alone. There's no sympathy in what they express to her. If anything, the view of her is through their eyes at the beginning. So, they even say, well, Mabel, and what are you going to do with yourself? And it even says with foolish flippancy, like, what are you going to do with yourself now that dad's died? He doesn't even say that. And he doesn't seem to recognize either that that's a scary thing to demand of her. It even says he did not care about anything since he felt safe himself. So he's not sympathetic to her situation. And she doesn't answer. Why do you think she doesn't answer?
Probably because they're not going to listen to her anyway.
Right. I mean, if she said, I don't want to go to my sister's house, they would have just argued with her and told her all the reasons she had to. If she said, oh, I'll go be a governess, they would have said, well, that's not going to work. You'd be a terrible governess. No matter what she says, they're not really, honestly, in some ways, she's like a post. She's just sitting there and they don't expect her to say anything. They even say, they call her bulldog, has a bulldog face. But she doesn't even express her emotions to them. And so they resent her for that, but at the same time they judge her for everything. In some ways too, just because she's also alone, so she hasn't ever gotten married, and she's very old for not having gotten married. This is an old maid status. So 27 is way old. And it even says she would have been good looking, except for that bulldog face, as far as her brothers are concerned. And so, does she doesn't answer because she knows they don't want to hear anything from her. And what's her truth? She's not going to go and visit her sisters. She's not going to go live with somebody else. She's not going to go become a governess. She's already kind of decided what she's going to do, and it's not good. And it's because she really doesn't have any choice, or she feels like she doesn't. She could go and be with her sister, but then she'd be like the third wheel in everything. And this is really common for unmarried women once their parents have died. It's really common for widows. Often a widow, she loses her husband and then there's no place for her to live. Somebody new in the family, inherits the house because she can't own it. And they literally take over. And then they do what they can to find a place for her to be so that she's not in the house with them. And it's really sad, but it's really common, unfortunately, too. And they just, especially if there's money owed, then they're really in trouble. But in this case, though, they're really worried about themselves. And so they don't have time, energy, they don't care enough to worry about their sister. And so essentially we find out as we go along that all their situations have changed. And so they're all kind of despondent about it all. And then but they're all they all kind of have their plans already figured out. So once they have the house all gone, then they're going to move in different directions and stuff like that. And so when she didn't answer, remember, she didn't say anything. And he says, well, you'll go and stop with Lucy for a bit, shan't you? And the girl did not answer. And then Fred Henry says, well, I don't see what else you can do. And she didn't answer. I mean, but literally, no matter what they say, the girl doesn't say a word. And then Malcolm says, if I was her, I would go in for training for a nurse. And Mabel did not take notice of him. They had talked at her and round her for so many years that she hardly heard them at all. And that's a horribly lonely expression. And I don't know if you've ever, I don't know what your family life is like. I know my extended family has a lot of, my grandmother used to call them chiefs. And she says, we need more squaws. We need more, people who aren't in charge or don't think they're in charge, because the chiefs all get in the way of each other and boss each other around, and nobody listens to anybody else, And so that unfortunately happens a lot, where there can be you can be surrounded by people and still utterly emotionally and psychologically isolated. And that's kind of where she is. Why talk to him? Why answer any of the questions? Because they're just going to argue or they're going to ignore you. Like if she says, well, I don't want to go to my sister Lucy's. Well, but you don't have any choice. Henry might even say again, well, I don't see what else you can do. It's not like you really have a choice. And so why engage? And she's just kind of given up. Now, who else comes into this? So while they're talking to her about her sister, she does admit that her sister wrote her and she says she can go and live with her if she likes. And then somebody says, well, then you'd better. So they're deciding for her, talking at her instead of to her. And then who comes in?
Dr. Ferguson.
Yes. And he actually knows the men and knows her too, but I mean, knows the men better because men are allowed to hang out with other men, not with other women that they're not married to. So, and she's already in a dark state. I mean, it's kind of like, I'm not talking to anybody, but he comes in. Well, they see him first out the window. And how does he change the dynamic? So he comes in and he's got a coat, an overcoat and a scarf and a cap. So it's cold outside and he looks exhausted. So he's long and his face was rather long and pale. His eyes looked tired. So he's probably been, doctors at this time did a lot of going from door to door. They go and visit the patients instead of having a doctor's office necessarily. And he is a doctor. So, and he is kind of sick. So he even says, he goes, we got to be out by Wednesday. Got a cold? And he says, I have got it bad too. So he's sick and cold at the same time. And he says, why don't you stop in? One of the brothers does. And he goes, me stop in? When I can't stand on my legs, perhaps I shall have a chance. In other words, I have too much work to do. And he says that, and one of the brothers, Joe, actually says it's not good if a doctor goes around croaking with a cold. And the doctor just looks at him like, what is he supposed to do? But they're kind of like snotty to each other and yet in a playful way. And they banter back and forth. But it's funny because they're doing the bantering And then Mabel stands up, and they all seem to become aware of her existence, and she starts putting away the dishes. It's funny because at that point the guys ignore, except the young doctor looks at her but does not address her. He hadn't actually spoken directly to her either, so even he wasn't making direct conversation with her. She went out of the room with a tray, her face impassive and unchanged. And then the doctor asks, this is the man who came in, he goes, well, are you off then, all of you? And Malcolm says yes. And so essentially they're going through, and it says, and so they're all kind of getting up to go. And then the doctor says, well, this is the devil's own, when he's just talking to Fred Henry. And he goes, going before Wednesday, that's the orders. To Northampton, that's it. And Ferguson's just kind of commiserating with them, like they have to leave. And the doctor says, well, I'll miss you, Freddie. I'll miss you too, Jack. And they were kind of friends, I guess. But then Fred Henry turned aside. There was nothing to say. Mabel came in again to finish clearing the table. And then he directly addresses her. What are you going to do then, Miss Purvin? Going to your sister's? Mabel looked at him with her steady, dangerous eyes that always made him uncomfortable, unsettling his superficial ease. So he knows he's putting on an act, trying to be all boisterous and jovial and stuff like that when he's exhausted and he has a cold and things like that. She doesn't do that. She doesn't do the fine weather we're having and let's talk about nothing and pretend to be all polite. So she just looks at him and says, no. And then Fred Henry argues with her immediately. Remember, she didn't answer them all those other times they were questioning. She didn't say a word. And as soon as she said no, Fred Henry tears into her. Well, what in the name of fortune are you going to do? Say what you mean to do, cried Fred Henry with futile intensity. She only averted her head and continued her work. And then her brother just calls her sulky. Well, he actually calls her a horrible name, but he's just dismissive. She's not talking. And the doctor watched her the whole time as she went out. Okay. So Fred Henry, essentially criticizes her again. The doctor only smiles faintly and then asks, what's she going to do then? And he goes, strike me if I know. And then he follows her out, essentially. And so then he goes out and he catches, let's see, where is it? And they tell more of the story, that she'd kept house ever since mom died, was just a fixture. It was like she was a servant. She just kept doing all of the stuff in the women, that the women's role was. Men might be foul-mouthed. The women in the kitchen might have bad reputations. Her brothers might have illegitimate children, but so long as there was money, she felt okay. But now there's no money. There's nothing. She has absolutely nothing. And so once dad's gone, what else is there? What's her future? And she, in a way, it's almost like the author explains why this is the end. And this is why. I mean, he even says this was at an end. She thought of nobody, not even of herself. Mindless and persistent, she seemed in a sort of ecstasy to be coming nearer to her fulfillment, her own glorification, approaching her dead mother who was glorified. There's actually a movie, and it's based on it has Tom Hanks on it, but it's based on a movie that's actually a foreign movie with a different name, but it's called The Man Called Otto, and it's on Netflix. And I'll put that. Let me open up the chat for a second. But it's on Netflix. But it's a man called Otto, and he is a widower. His wife died quite a while ago, and I guess it gets to some point where he's just done. And so it's not as sad as you think, but it ends up being, he lives in this little subdivision and he keeps trying to commit suicide and it keeps not working because people keep interrupting him. And he essentially realizes how much he's part of the community, that he's not as ignored as he thinks he is. But in this case, she has nothing. Her brothers are moving away. They don't care. Her dad and mom are both gone. And so she's looking at this part of it, that she's going to approach her dead mother. So she's going to die, and then she can be with her mom, and then her name is just Wow Mabel. She's no longer a servant. She doesn't have to put up with any of this anymore. It's kind of trying to explain why she would attempt suicide. And so she goes and visits the grave first, remember, for her mom. And she clips the grass from the grave and arranges the pinky white small chrysanthemums in the tin cross. When this was done, she took an empty jar from a neighboring grave, brought water, and sponged the marble headstone and the coping stone. So she essentially adds flowers to mom's grave. I mean, will her brothers ever do it? No. Her dad's dead, so he's not going to do it. But this is the last time she can do this. And who's watching while she does all of this?
The doctor.
Yes, the doctor. He's kind of not supposed to be, and yet he is. He's absolutely watching her as she does all of this. So first we get her perspective, and then we get the doctor's house was just by the church, and it explains too that he's one of those visiting doctors. So he's a slave to the countryside, and he's going to attend to the outpatients, but he sees her in the graveyard, and he stops. And then just as he's watching her and kind of slowed down, she lifts her eyes and feels him looking. And their eyes meet. And then as soon as they do, like, oops, like you look away, like, oh no, I wasn't supposed to be watching, like, and it gets super polite. You're trying to be super polite. But it's funny, he lifted his cap, passed down the road, and yet there's something about it. The memory of her face, the narrator says, lifted from the tombstone and looking at him with slow, large, portentous eyes, like there's something going on. And he can't even really describe why it happens the way that it does. Like, why did that matter? And it said he had been weak and feeling weak and done before, but now the life came back into him. He felt delivered from his own fretted daily self. So there was something she inspired in him. Just by that look, it had a positive effect on him. So then he goes and visits some other people, and he's walking from place to place and everything. And what happens then? Now it's afternoon.
Isn't that when she headed into the woods towards the pond?
Right.
Yeah.
So he's on his way back from all of those little visits to this patient and that patient and the other patient and all that, and he could see the stables and outbuildings distinctly. And he even thought, well, I guess there's, I won't be visiting there much more because all the guys are leaving. And he said, it was just kind of sad, probably because they're young like he is, but then let's see, where is it? But then he sees her. So he's looking kind of over the whole landscape, noticing her old house and stuff. But then roving across the landscape, the doctor's quick eye detected a figure in black passing through the gate of the field towards the pond. And he looked again. It would be Mabel Pervin. His mind suddenly became alive and attentive. So we have to look at, I had some interesting interpretations of this, that he was just, kind of saving her life or whatever, because he was a doctor. And yet he is drawn to her all the way through this story so far. And, when he sees her in any of his vision, he's kind of locked on her, even if he knows it's impolite. And so he starts following her. And eventually, and he had to keep his eyes on her, because in the gathering mist, he was going to lose her if he doesn't keep his eyes on her. So he follows her. She's not paying attention to him at all. She doesn't even think about it. There she stood on the bank for a moment. She never raised her head, and she waded slowly into the water. And he's just kind of struck dumb, like, what in the world is she doing? And then she's gone. And he says, there, would you believe it? Which is just a weird thing to say, in my opinion. But it's like, oh my God, she's committing suicide. Like and part of this is, in our day, like today's world, we would say, oh my gosh, she's killing herself. We would say that. You can't say that back then. Like even with Desiree and her baby, she wanders off with her baby out into the woods and is never seen again. It doesn't say, she went and killed herself and drowned herself in the river. Nope. In the bayou. It doesn't say any of that, because you can't say that. It's like not polite. And so even he's kind of holding back a little, but he says, would you believe it? And then it says it took him several minutes to come to the pond. So he's running down there and everything, but it still takes him a bit to get there. He stood on the bank. He could see nothing. And it says, yes, perhaps that was the dark shadow of her black clothing, but he's not even sure he could see her in the water. And he goes in. Now, remember, he's sick with the cold. He's exhausted. And plus this is a really cold pond. And I don't know if you've ever swum in a super cold pond or a cold ocean, but I have. And it's rough anyway. And it smells bad. So, I don't know if you've ever swum in one of those, the ponds with the slushy bottom to them, that's all green and squishy. Oh, not fun either. But it picks it up in this story. So it definitely helped me remember that it's just gross. But still, repelled and yet not heeding, he moved deeper into the pond. The lower part of his body all sunk in the hideous cold element, and the bottom was so deeply soft and uncertain, he was afraid of pitching with his mouth underneath. So, and the thing is too, and this is what we find out, this is really important, he could not swim. And so he literally went out just a little bit, hoping to be able to feel for her. And he finally caught her clothing, but it evaded his fingers. He made a desperate effort to grasp it. This is really, it's a dramatic story. And then he loses his balance and goes under. And then finally he gets his footing, rose again into the air and looked around, and he knew he wasn't dead. Okay. Then he looked at the water. She had risen near him. He grasped her clothing and, drawing her nearer, turned to take his way to land again. So he gets her, and he's kind of crawling back up the slushy underside to get back to the shore. And at that point, everything they're all covered with that kind of clay, guppy water that's just nasty. And so then he made the water come from her mouth, and he works on her, to revive her, because she's been in there for several minutes now. And then she was breathing again. So it's all right. Mostly he's trying to make sure she doesn't like choke on water that's still in her lungs and things like that, which is a possibility. Actually, if someone almost drowns, they can actually drown later if you don't get all the water out of their lungs. And so then he wipes. So he could feel her live beneath his hands. She was coming back. He wiped her face, wrapped her in his overcoat. Of course, he's sick and exhausted, and he is freezing cold too. But and then he lifts her and staggered down the bank and across the field. So he's carrying her across the fields now, and he's exhausted already. Remember, he was tired at the beginning of the day, and now he's just, kind of at his end. He opened the door, goes in the house. That's their house. So in the kitchen, he laid her down on the hearth rug and called. The house was empty, but the fire was burning in the grate. So at least they have some warmth in there. And her eyes, so she's breathing, but her eyes are also wide open, as if conscious, but there seemed something missing in her look. She was conscious in herself, but unconscious of her surroundings. What do we call it? That comatose or something? And he goes in, and essentially everything he's doing is to try to get her warm again. And finally, alcohol does it. So he finds some whiskey, drank a gulp of it himself, which I can totally get. And then he puts some of it in her mouth. And she even says his name. She, opens her eyes wide, looks at him and says, Dr. Ferguson? And he goes, what? Which is just funny. Some of this dialogue is hilarious to me, but it's really, I like this story, in case you guys can't figure that one out. And so he says, she says, what did I do? And he says, walked into the pond. Now, notice how he doesn't say, you try to commit suicide. So they're staying on that polite edge still, but he knows what she tried and she knows what she tried. And she says, was I out of my mind? And he says, maybe for a moment. Am I out of my mind now? And he says, I don't see that you are. And he says he turned his face aside. He was afraid now because he felt dazed and felt dimly that her power was stronger than his. And so he wants to go to polite. So he asks about the dry things. And she says, did you dive in the pond for me? So she's not doing any more polite. She's all done. And this is very, very typically D.H. Lawrence, that he goes beyond this polite niceties that don't mean anything and gets to the heart. And she's all done with the polite niceties. So she says, did you dive in the pond for me? No, I walked in. But I went overhead as well to try to find her. And he says, it says he wanted to go up stairs and get dry clothing, but he says there was another desire in him. And I think we'll stop there because it's 4:59. We are going to start right back here tomorrow morning, because this is the crux of what it is. A lot of people, there's a big question, is he really in love with her? Is he really attracted to her? Is she actually in love with him, or are they just both desperate? What exactly is going on? And I think there are going to be some clues in here that will help you guys. So do you have any questions before then?
You go.
Oh,
you
go
can
ahead.
No, you can.
Go
Oh,
ahead.
I was just I still wasn't quite sure. Do we need to those of us who are writing our own stories for our essay, do we need to make a works cited list?
That's what I forgot to talk about. I scrolled through the chat and went, oh no, I haven't talked about that. Okay, the only thing that you have to do is, for whatever your inspiration story is, make sure and cite that in the works cited page.
Okay, so we will need a short little one.
Yeah, it's very, it would just, and if you have room on that last page, you don't need a new page or anything. You can just fit it on there. And the other,
Okay, thank you.
and if you're writing about both short stories, and you're comparing them, all you would cite are those two short stories. You don't have to have any outside sources beyond that. Okay?
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I have some questions about the final, or like the tests
Mhm.
for this unit. Are the questions based off of like the stories we've read and the journal stuff, or is it the stuff that's in the book?
Most of it is going to be on the stories themselves.
Okay, so are we allowed to use like our notes? Like I've been writing down my answers to each question.
That's probably okay. Just you won't be able to, it'll be through Respondus lockdown browser, so you won't be able to open up like the textbook or anything like that, or any of the stories. But if you have notes, that's fine. You will have a monitor on there so that it will be taking, but if you have you've just written notes about certain things, that's fine. It's just going to be gauging how much do you look down. So if all you're doing is looking down, that it's going to assume that you're reading something just to get whatever you need. But honestly, it's fine if you have some notes. You probably honestly won't need them. As long as you remember the stories and the characters, it's not going to be something like, there is a matching section, but it's not like author title or something like that. It's much more about who the characters were and what they did in the story.
Okay.
So if you've read the stories and make sure you read, if there's anyone you missed, make sure you read it. But as long as you've read all the stories, you're going to do fine on the test.
All right. I just have testing anxiety.
I understood.
So if I can have notes, I want to just because it'll make me a little bit more at peace.
That's
And
fine.
I've never done tests with the webcam before, so I'm nervous about all that. And I know it says like every time you look away from the camera or anything like that, it'll count points off.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't score your test. All it's going to do
Okay,
is it's going to give me
a
markers,
flag.
and then I'll look at all of those myself.
Okay,
And
so if it is
honestly,
just like I'm
okay,
checking a note, like it'll flag it, but you'll know that it's
yeah.
just a note, and I'm not like reading off something.
Well, and you're
And I'm
not
not
getting
supposed
up and
to.
leaving. You're not. I mean, the main thing what I don't want is somebody to pick up their phone and be what if you're
Yeah,
trying to enter a bunch of questions in your phone and stuff. That's going to be flagged all over the place. And if I see 55 flags in 75 minutes, that's a lot. Especially
yeah,
if you look down for 3 or 4 minutes at a time. That's a long time to look down in a 75-minute test. And honestly, most people um, they finish their test between 30 and 45 minutes. It doesn't very few people will take the full 75 minutes to do it. I've never had anybody in this class run out of time. Like, oh no, and if they did, it's because they were looking everything up.
okay.
But I would not be, I mean, as long as you've read everything, you'll be fine.
I definitely have. I just get really scared that like I'll forget stuff. So I just know that I'll feel much better if I can have my notes from my notebook.
Yeah, as long as you don't use them extensively, you'll be fine.
Okay, thank you so much.
No problem. Any other questions?
I have a quick question.
Okay.
Will there be any questions on the test from our reading segments in the textbook?
There may be ones about, like, for instance, um, the rising action and falling action and stuff like that in plot,
Oh,
that kind of stuff. But I'll
thank you.
try to give you a kind of a heads up of what before we take the test. It'll probably be sometime, at least by the end of next week. I'll give you a list of what's going to be covered. And if there's a story I'm not going to put on the test, I'll let you know what that is. So I'll only list out the stories and the terms that you're going to need to know. Okay?
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you for coming, you two. Have a great evening.
You
You
too.
too.